The Mitch Marner era is over in Toronto, but is the departure of a perennial 100-point scorer actually going to be the key to the Leafs getting out of the second round? This is the 2025-26 deep dive on the Toronto Maple Leafs. Hello and welcome to team number 9 on my preseason power rankings. Today we're talking about the Toronto Maple Leafs, and the Leafs are an interesting team. They're always going to be controversial because it's Toronto. And this offseason was an important one for them because obviously you had the loss of Mitch Marner, but it was more about how they replaced him. And as we kind of go through this here, we'll see the moves that they made, or in some cases the lack of moves that they made. But when looking at the Leafs roster, right, they still have Auston Matthews, who was apparently dealing with an injury last season. You have William Nylander, who I think is a very, very good hockey player. You have the reemergence of John Tavares, which I think will help this team if he can continue playing the way he was last season. You still have a pretty solid blue line behind that. And you have, the goalie combination with Stolarz and Wolf, which I think is, one of the better goalie tandems in the league. There's still a lot to really like about the Leafs, right? You lose Mitch Marner, which is going to hurt them offensively. Like, there's just no denying that. Whether or not you think Mitch Marner was a playoff performer or not is irrelevant to the fact that they're going to miss his production during the regular season, and you need to make the playoffs before you can win a Stanley Cup. But, and they said the same thing about Phil Kessel, and then Phil Kessel won back-to-back Stanley Cups. So we'll see. The biggest concern that I have is just the offensive production, right? Like, and even from a playoff perspective, the matchups that happened because Mitch Marner was on the ice are going to become less, like, teams are going to have to give up less defensive stock and resources to the Marner line now because he's not there. So that all does play a factor in how this team is going to play, and there's definitely a lot of intriguing factors about that right now. I think it's been pretty. I've been pretty open about the fact that I think Mitch Marner is one of the better players in the NHL. So losing him does hurt them in a sense. Well, it does, but not in a sense. It does hurt them. But I don't think they did a terrible job, filling out the lineup with the money that he left on the table, right? Like, I think they did fine in that aspect. Again, this wasn't the free agent class to go out and make, splashy moves. There really wasn't that many big names outside of Mitch Marner and Nikolai Ehlers, and obviously they weren't going to re-sign Mitch Marner. So, it's such a unique offseason for them. I think obviously the play is going to be doing something this summer because there's potential for some pretty big names to be available. So we'll see what happens, right? Like, they're just in a very unique position at this point. And do I think they got worse this offseason? Yeah, probably. I think that, the net overall, rating that Mitch Marner adds to the team was not replaced in totality, right? But do I think that they're still a really good team that can contend for, something in the season? Yeah, I mean, I have them 9th currently. I think, especially in the NHL, if you get into the top 10-ish, you're going to have a shot to do something, right? Like, they've still have themselves in range to potentially make something happen this season. So they're a very unique team in that sense. I don't think their division does them too many favors, but obviously I have them 3rd in the Atlantic right now in my rankings, if you're following along with that. So we'll see what happens. But for me, the Leafs are a fascinating team because, well, one, you have, one of the two teams that's ahead of them, the Florida Panthers, who I've, repeatedly said throughout this, don't seem to really care about the regular season, which is good news for the Leafs because that means that there's, an opening within one of those top two teams. So, the Leafs are fascinating to me. We'll kind of dive into their team as we've done for all of these and just kind of dissect the roster and see, how I think everybody's going to kind of play out. So, we look at their overview here and, 7th in offense, 9th in defense, 9th in goaltending. they're top 10 pretty much everywhere, right? Like 9th in special teams, 13th in coaching culture. Like they're essentially top 10 pretty much across the board. The 13th in coaching culture is what it is. But I do think that, overall, like the offense is still really good. You still have Austin Matthews. You still have William Nylander. You still have John Tavares, who looks really good. You still have Matthew Knies, who I think is really the X factor on this team in terms of like productivity and what he can do to step up and replace a lot of what they lost in Marner. So yeah, I obviously, you lose Marner, but this offense is still really good. I still think that they added depth this this offseason. Like, the Nicolas Waugh ad is really good. The Maccelli ad I really like. I've been a big fan of Maccelli. I just don't think he had the opportunity in Utah. So a fresh start for him might be good. Last year he was kind of getting thrown around the lineup. We'll talk about him in a bit. Defensively, I think this blue line's kind of underrated because, Morgan Rielly isn't the bona fide number one D that he was back in the, a couple years ago. But they still have, pretty good depth across the lineup. And then in net, like I said, it's one of the better tandems in the league. I don't think they really have, a true 1A at this moment. Stolarz' numbers are really good, but they've all been in a pretty small sample. So that does hurt him, like, in terms of, like, how I rate him overall, just because he hasn't done it, like, playing 55, 60 games, like some of the other goalies that are rated higher than him have, even though his numbers are, might be better. They've just been in a smaller sample size. But I think the pairing between him and Joseph Woll is still really good. Special teams, obviously the offense is very good. Defensively, I think they're a little underrated in terms of what their penalty kill can do. And, the coaching culture is, it's Brad Shiliving's second off season. I think that he's done fine. I don't think that he's, blown me away with anything that he's done. I think his trade deadline was somewhat erratic. I think that, a couple of the trades that he made were, overpays in terms of what they brought in. But, he's still decent enough. And then Craig Berube, who I'm not like the biggest fan of, but I think, his floor is exceptionally high. So, I think, Craig Berube gets a lot of credit for the St. Louis Blues season, but that was a season where, the team was the bottom of the league and had a bunch of things go right? Like it wasn't, Craig Berube didn't coach Jordan Binnington into going on a crazy run. So I don't give him, I give him credit for that. Obviously, that Stanley Cup win, but I think that people overvalue what that Stanley Cup win meant. But I still think Craig Berube is a pretty good coach. So I'm not trying to take anything away from him there. But let's jump into the coaching culture here as we kind of touch on that. Obviously, Craig Berube I have as a B+. Brad Shiliving I have a C+. Again, like nothing that he's done has blown me away. I don't think he's done anything super egregious, but I think, his trade deadline was a little, pricey. I think his offseason was fine in terms of what he did this summer. But yeah, I mean, the Leafs should be a playoff team. There's no really doubt in my mind, barring massive injury, that, the Toronto Maple Leafs are going to be, pushing for one of those top 3 spots in the Atlantic and are going to be, in the hunt. But again, like with this team, like we say every year with the Leafs, the regular season doesn't really matter. It's what you do in the playoffs that's going to determine how good, this team is going to be and, how they're going to be remembered. And we look at their numbers from last year and, 4th in the NHL in terms of, points percentage, 1st in the division. Their goals for numbers actually weren't great. 10th in goals for, 16th in expected goals for. And both those numbers I expect to take a bit of a hit, right? Like you lose Marner. I think it's a lot to ask Matthew Knies to step in and be, an immediate, 100-point guy. I think that's a lofty goal to set for him. I think he'll have a good season, but I think that's a lot to ask. And then, you're bringing in the depth on this team, but like, even if you can replace the production from Marner, this was a team that was still 10th in goals for and, middle of the pack in terms of their expected goals for. It wasn't like they were like number 1 in the league, right? So it's not like if you replace the Marner production that all of a sudden, everything's fine, because it's still a team that, didn't generate a ton of chances and, we're 10th in goals for. And if you're competing for a Stanley Cup, that's probably not going to get it done. 3rd in goals against is really good. This team was exceptional in terms of, not allowing goals. But again, like their expected goals against numbers weren't great in terms of, what they put up. Evolving Hockey has them more around 16th, but even then, right? Even if we say they're 16th, 17th in the league, that's still not great, and you'd expect those numbers to potentially regress a little bit in terms of what they allowed, especially because the goaltending isn't world-beating goaltending. I think it's just a pretty good tandem with a pretty high floor, but I don't know if it's not, they don't have one of the best goalies in the league behind them, for 50 games a year. Again, like Stoller's numbers are really good, but they've been in a pretty small sample size. So overall, I question the defense less, honestly. I think that, this team, the Craig Berube system should be able to fix some of those issues. And I don't think they have to be, exceptional in terms of expected goals against. I think that their team system and their goaltending can kind of, elevate that as they did last year. I just don't think it'll be to that level. In terms of their goals for, that is kind of where I have a bit of concern. I don't know if those numbers will maintain in the same level that they were at last season. And that would concern me slightly, especially, when you have to go through either a Tampa Bay or Florida or both potentially to get out of the Atlantic, not even the Eastern Conference. That's a big ask for this team, especially, losing Marner in that sense. And we jump into this offense. And again, I still really like this offense. I think it's a really, really good unit. Matthew Knies obviously is the X factor here, but you still have, Austin Matthews, who's one of the best players in the NHL. You still have John Tavares, who had an exceptional season last year. He was fantastic. William Nylander, again, one of the best wingers in the league. But like I said, Matthew Knies is the X factor here, right? If Matthew Knies can come in and step up and replace, 80% of what Mitch Marner was, then the Leafs should be fine, right? I don't think they're going to be much better than they were last season, but they'll, it's going to be hard. I mean, they finished 4th in the league, right? That's a big ask to ask from them to do again. But I think, overall in terms of, production, if Knies can make up, 80-85% of what Marner was, then that's great. But that's a big ask for somebody who's, just stepping into their NHL career as a whole. But the depth behind that, is pretty good. I love Nicolas Roy. I think that he's, a really, really good third-line center. Matias Maccelli, who I talked about, had a down season last year, but is somebody that I'm intrigued by. The depth around them isn't anything, insane. You have, Bobby McMahon, David Kampf, who I think is underrated but overpaid. Max Domi is a fun player. Scott Laughton, again, I think they've massively overpaid for what Scott Laughton is. Calle Jonkirk, Steven Lorenz. They also brought in Dakota Joshua, who isn't on this lineup currently, but is still, about that same tier. He's a okay 4th liner. He's fun. He hits a lot. People like him, but, he's not moving the needle for the bottom 6. So it's a really solid offensive core, right? Obviously you lose some of that top end talent, but they were able to replace it with some depth. I think Nicolas Roy and Matias Maccelli are good adds for the middle of this lineup. But you're really hoping that Matthew Knies can take that step up, and you're hoping that Max Domi can continue doing that too, because he needs to kind of stabilize that left side of the top 6. But that's really the big question here: is if Matthew Knies can take that next leap forward, then this offense should be in a pretty good spot. The star of this offense, obviously, is Austin Matthews, and he had a down season last year, right? His defensive numbers plummeted. His finishing took a huge dive, but over a 3-year sample, he's still generating offense like crazy. Even last year, I mean, he was still really good at that. It was just the finishing took a hit. I don't really have a lot of concerns, right? I think last year was an anomaly, and even last year, with him having a quote-unquote down season, he was still one of the best players in the league, right? We talk about this a lot with guys like McDavid and McKinnon and Matthews. I think Matthews got it a lot worse than a down season for Connor McDavid would be. I mean, Connor McDavid started last season pretty poorly, for his standards at least. But Matthews took it, he got it a lot more just because of the nature of being in Toronto and being Austin Matthews, being who he is. So I really think that the talk about Matthews, being falling off a cliff last season is really overblown. He's still one of the best players in the league. He's still in the discussion as a top 5 center in the NHL. I think that it's become more of a discussion than it was 2 years ago, but there's still, he's still very much in that group of players. And I'm not really, like I'm not concerned about it, right? A lot of it seemed to be injury related. And you're hoping that this year that's not an issue and he can bounce back, in quotes, and really improve, right? I think it's just the finishing and the defense that really concerned me. I mean, his play driving was fine. He still generated a ton of chances, but it's just, getting the finishing back up, becoming, getting back to being, arguably the best scorer in the NHL currently. And then obviously raising the defense back up, even if it doesn't go up to where it was, 2 seasons ago, getting it to about a middle ground between 2 years ago and last year, will be pretty good. But I'm not worried about Matthews. I think that the discourse around him is overblown simply because he plays for the Leafs. And that's just kind of the reality with a lot of these players, unfortunately. William Nylander, like I talked about, is one of, I think, the more underrated wingers in the league. And this is a guy who got a ton of crap in the playoffs, right? Along with Marner, especially in the first round. He was getting a lot of it from the media. Obviously, you had the I can't remember which random fourth line enforcer it was that called out William Nylander as like somebody who can't be the guy, and then Nylander immediately became like the leading scorer in the Leafs the rest of the playoffs. I can't remember who it was, but it was somebody in the media who called him out, and for some reason. But I mean, William Nylander has always been very consistent. Even like his playoff production has actually been fairly consistent. There's just people just don't like him because he plays for the Leafs. Leaf fans don't like him because he's not putting up 10 points a game. Whatever it is, he'll have to be the second guy now on Toronto, which is something that he hasn't really had to do. And it will be interesting to see how that transition goes, right? From being the third guy on the team to the second guy is a transition. And I'm intrigued to see how his development works in that sense. Can he, make that leap to be, put a little bit more pressure on him to, produce. Obviously, there's been pressure on him to produce his whole career. So I think, again, the nature of the market actually will help in this case because he's always had that pressure to produce as, a top 2 guy, even though he wasn't in a lot of cases. Like when John Tavares first came in, Nylander was probably the 4th most important player on the Leafs. But there was always that pressure on him to come in and be the guy. And so I think that in that case, like, he's been already trained for that. But the actual not having the safety net of Mitch Marner ahead of you is going to be interesting to see how he handles that. I think he'll be fine, but it's a fun note to keep in mind as we kind of go through what the Leafs are. That internal pressure and external pressure from the fan base is going to be interesting. I think that in order to appease the fans here, Nylander needs to be hovering around like a point a game plus, right? Like he needs to be in the 90s, probably in points for people to consider a successful season for him, even regardless of how good his actual like body of work is. I think that's going to be the baseline that he's going to be judged on, simply because those goals are going to be missing from other parts of the lineup. So he'll be a fascinating piece to watch throughout this year and to see how the reaction kind of follows him around, because he did get a bit of shit in the playoffs, and he's been the punching bag for a couple of years. Before that, one of the punching bags on the Leafs. So this is going to be a big year for him to kind of like, quote unquote, exercise those demons, even though I don't necessarily think there's any real demons for him to exercise, but just the figurative ones that the fans and the media have kind of put on him, unfair or not. Like I talked about, Matthew Knies, this is really the X factor here, right? And Matthew Knies is... I feel for him because he's really stepping into his like, really like the beginning of his career here, 22 years old, and he's going to be asked to be a first line player and a primary offensive contributor to this team. All right, now again, very similar to where Nylander was a couple years ago, he does have 3 other guys ahead of him that are supposed to produce more. Right. Well, depending on what you think of John Tavares, right? Like 2 guys for sure are supposed to produce more than him, right? Like Matthews and Nylander. I think if you were to poll fans for who the leading scorer is, those 2 would get the top 2 votes, and then Knies or Tavares would be 3rd on that list. But if he can come in and virtually replace what Marner's production was to a point. If he can replace what Nylander was producing, and then Nylander can kind of step up and be the Mitch Marner, then Toronto is going to be pretty good because their depth is better, right? Adding Michelli, adding Dakota Joshua, and adding Nicolas Waugh is making this team better. It's really about where the primary scoring is going to come from. And last year, Matthew Knies' numbers were really good, right? He was fantastic as an offensive contributor, right? Like he put up very, very good underlying numbers. His point totals were very solid for the role that he was given. But it really is going to come down to, can he do that again in a bigger role with more pressure, right? Because it's great to do it when people don't expect it from you, and then you're a hero. But when people are expecting you to be, a close to point a game producer, it's going to it does add pressure. And if you're not hitting that benchmark, then all of a sudden a 65-point season is a failure, which probably shouldn't be. So Matthew Knies is really the X factor on this team for me. He's going to be the deciding factor of whether Toronto's a good team, a very good team, or a true Stanley Cup contender. Because I know what I'm going to get out of William Nylander in all likelihood. I know what I'm going to get out of Austin Matthews in all likelihood. I have a pretty decent idea of what I'm going to get out of John Tavares, but we'll see. I expect a bounce back from Michelli. But Matthew Knies is really, really the X factor on this team. And if he can become one of those primary offensive contributors, then the Leafs are going to be very, very good this year. And if he can't, the Leafs are still going to be good. But I think that their ceiling starts to drop based on that. So Matthew Knies is truly an X factor for me. That's a lot of pressure to put on the kid. Like, I'm not saying he can do it. I'm not saying he can't do it. It's a wait and see thing for me. And he is easily the most intriguing player on this team for me, with Michelli being a very close second, because I think he is also a guy who could pop this season. But Matthew Knies, I think, has the best potential to really blow up this season, and I'm fascinated to see how that kind of plays out here for Toronto. John Tavares is another player who just, like, he's been getting better year over year. There was, I think it was 2 off seasons ago, we were talking about John Tavares, potentially having to move to wing because he can't play center anymore. And then all of a sudden now he's one of the better second line centers in the NHL. Maybe the best second line center in the NHL, outside of, like, unless you consider, Leon Draisaitl a second line center. But in terms of, like, true, like, 2Cs, he might be number 1 in the league right now. Like, it's insane the really turnaround that John Tavares has had, especially last year, where his finishing just went from the basement to, like, one of the best finishers in the league. Like, it was an insane season for him in terms of that. So for me, I'm just looking for consistency, right? I don't need John Tavares to get better. I don't need him to, stay the same. I just need him to be, in the ballpark of where he was last year. Do I expect him to be the insane finisher that he was last year? Probably not, right? The law of averages tells you that shouldn't be the case again. If he does it again, like, that's fantastic. Like, that's great. But in reality, for, a 34 going on 35 John Tavares, the expectation should be he can be, stable defensively where he's been relatively. He can still be a decent play driver and finish at, a decent rate and be a good be like a stable second line center. That's the expectation for John Tavares. I think he can easily hit that, especially based on the trajectory that he's been on. Like, do I think he's going to be better than last year? Probably not, right? Like, I think that's asking a lot. Can he be stable to what he was last year? Yeah. But I think, even if he takes, like, a slight step down, which I think is to be expected, Tavares is still going to be a very, very nice piece for this team, especially at the cap it. Like, people talk about the state tax discount, but, like, John Tavares' contract is fantastic, right? And it's a high tax Toronto, so there you go. But yeah, I think I'm very. I'd be thrilled with the production they got out of John Tavares. I think he absolutely redeemed himself from the decline that he was on a couple years ago. And if he can produce somewhat similar to what he did last season, people are going to be pretty happy. And that'll be a key part to really lifting up the ceiling for this Leafs team. Matias Maccelli, let's talk about this because his underlying numbers last year are actually still pretty solid. But if we look, a couple years ago, even 2-3 years ago, he was an analytics darling. Like the numbers that he was putting up, he was fantastic. And I really like this bet for the Leafs because the problem with Maccelli last year, especially, is he was just getting bounced around the lineup too much. Right? He's a really good player, but Utah has a lot of really good, top 6 forwards right now. Their top 6 is pretty set. If you go watch my Utah Mammoth preview, you'll see like their top 6 is pretty good. And a lot of those guys need the ice time, right? Like you're not going to sit Dylan Guenther, you're not going to sit Logan Cooley for Maccelli, right? Like you're going to play those guys. And he just needed kind of a change of scenery. So his quote unquote overall at the beginning is lower than I would have had it last season, but it's just because like his role was very convoluted last year and he did take a dip and you could see that, he wasn't as motivated because he wasn't in a consistent role. And he's going to get that in Toronto, right? He's going to be given an opportunity to be that, second line winger, playing with John Tavares. He's going to be pretty stable there. And I think that that's going to be very good for the production that he's going to get, right? He's not going to get the first line defensive competition, right? That's going to go to the Matthews line. I really think that Maccelli could be a very, very productive player this year for the Leafs offensively. I truly believe that he could be, we talk about Matthew Knies as an X factor, but you want to add like a second X factor to this team, it's Maccelli. And I think he's somebody who could be, a very, very underrated player. And at the end of the year, people are like, wow, this guy's really good. And it's going to look like a fleece for Utah. And I want Utah fans that are watching this to not freak out because like you weren't going to get that kind of production out of Maccelli if he does end up being, a 60-plus point scorer. It just wasn't going to happen because you didn't have the room for him in the top 6. And that's fine, right? Like, that's okay. It's very much going to be... It's very much the first year of Max Pacioretty out of Montreal where, like, you knew he was going to be really good. And you just kind of had to accept it because there was better things coming. And I think that that's going to be kind of the case here with Utah and Maccelli where people are going to look at it and be like, how could they let him go? And it's like, well, they just didn't have room for him. And that's fine. And he'll get an opportunity to be really good in Toronto. And I think that he could be... He's a lot safer of a bet in terms of like what I expect from him to get, especially now. So I do think that he's going to be a key piece to what this middle 6 is going to look like, and I'm excited for it because I've been a Maccelli fan for a while. I mean, like I said, he was an analytics darling like 2-3 years ago, and last year he took a bit of a dip, but again, a lot of that had to do because of the fluctuation in what his role was throughout the season. Nicolas Waugh is another guy that I really like, and he's, his offensive numbers have been pretty average for the last couple of years. He's been pretty stable in terms of his offensive production, but his defense has been pretty good. Like he's been a really strong defensive like third line center, and I think that gives the Leafs a very stable option in that spot, right? And it's been a situation that they've tried to replace a couple times. They brought in Scott Laughton obviously to be that role. A couple years ago, we've seen them, try to trade for that third line center spot and find that defensive presence kind of for the bottom 6. And I really think they found him now, right? I think Nicolas Waugh is somebody that I've been fantasy booking for the Leafs for a couple years, if you've been following me, just because I think that he's a really good fit for the team. And he was underplayed in Vegas for a little bit just because of how deep their center core was. Last year he did play, with the traditional third line center role, and his numbers were very solid in that position. So I think that he'll be a very natural slot to kind of fit in behind Matthews and Tavares and bump Laughton down, ideally to the fourth line where I think he'll be better served as well. So like overall, I think it's a really, really good fit. Obviously, like people are going to talk about him compared to what Mitch Marner is going to put up, which is completely unfair for what Nicolas Waugh is. But getting him back in that trade, I think, is actually like a really good addition for them because, for $3 million, he'll be a very solid third line center for exactly what they need, which is a defensive presence, kind of in that bottom 6. Max Domi is another wild card on this team, right? Like, I've been really high on Max Domi for a while, and people who followed me for a while know that He's been somebody that I've been banging the drum for as, a top 6 player for a while. And he's looked like it in good portions of his time in Toronto, right? Like, he's been given that role quite a bit. He's had, success. He's had, ups and downs, obviously, in his time in Toronto. But I think that, especially now being asked to be like the 6th forward in that top 6, is going to be a lot better for him, right? I think that you get Maccelli, who can be, another offensive producer. Matthew Knies has now fully, stepped up to be, a top line player. It takes some of that pressure off of Domi, and I think Domi is going to actually mesh really well with what Maccelli can do, and kind of be the forechecker on that line and get into the battles more, because that was something that we really didn't see from him a lot, especially defensively. Were just his retrieval percentages, right? Like his attempts to, get the puck and win those battles. He just wasn't being put in a position to be that kind of primary guy, and I think he wants to be, right? Like, Max Domi has that attitude where he just wants to be the guy digging in the corners and winning those battles, and I think that he'll have a better opportunity to do that now with a revamped second line. I think that he'll be given a lot more offensive opportunities because they're going to have, Maccelli being a better offensive player than what he had there last season. I expect Domi to have a strong season this year. Again, like, he's one of my guys. He's somebody that I've liked for a while, but I expect him to be able to step in and be, with less pressure to be, a primary offensive guy on that second line. He'll be able to have a bigger influence, in quotes, on what his role is. Whereas, like, now he'll be kind of stable in what he's supposed to do. Where I feel like the last couple of years he's just kind of been thrown around. There's been situations where he was supposed to be, the offensive guy on the line. He was supposed to be more the quote unquote power forward on the line. He was supposed to be the defensive guy. Now I think that his role has been a lot more defined with the addition of Maccelli, and I think that he'll complement that group really well. Kind of jumping into the bottom 6 here, Steven Lorentz was somebody that they brought in last year, and I really like him. I think especially for the cap hit for what he's supposed to do, just as another defensive piece on this team. He's really developed into a really nice bottom 6 defender. His penalty kill numbers are phenomenal, and I think that adds to how good that overall unit can be. And it's an underrated penalty kill unit. Everybody's going to talk about the power play because it's got all the stars on it. But, the Leafs have brought in some pretty good penalty killers, and Steven Lorentz was one of them. And he had a really, really strong season in that role last year, as well as just as a defensive, bottom 6 kind of guy. His competition level isn't very high. He's not going to score a lot of goals, but he's going to do, those small things that coaches love. He's going to be somebody you can rely upon to throw it on the ice with a lead and protect it. And, the championship teams have those kind of players, right? Like, I look at the Leafs, overall build here for the offense, and I do really like the structure of the team, right? Again, like, I think that there's concerns, they're mild concerns, but there's concerns about the top end scoring. You lose Mitch Marner, there's going to be concerns about that because you got worse in that area. Hey, hate to tell you, Leafs fans, but you got worse offensively because of the loss of, one of the best offensive players in the league. But the rest of the team is structured really, really well, and in a way that is going to, they're built they have the building blocks of a championship team here still. And a lot of it's going to, require the growth of the offense here. But in terms of what the bottom 6 is, like, I like the structure of the bottom 6. I like the layout of what this team looks like, kind of top to bottom in that sense. Jumping to the blue line here, and again, like, it's a unit that I think is really good. You have Chris Tanev, who is one of, if not the best defensive defenseman in the NHL right now. Morgan Rielly is still a very effective, top line defenseman who can still be a good offensive contributor. Jake McCabe, I think, is very underrated and has always been really underrated. As a really strong number 3 guy, and I think that's the exact role that he's in here. But then you have some other additions. They added Brandon Carlo at the deadline, who I think is fine. He's a good defensive defenseman. He's not, going to blow you away, but he's a strong, number 4 option there. Oliver Ekman-Larsson they brought in, who, again, like, I think is very good depth. And then you got, Simon Benoit, who I'm not the biggest fan of. I'd like to see a bit more, another, dynamic defenseman in that third line role, but like Benoit as your sixth defenseman with the way that this blue line is structured, I think is really good. Again, like I think they're missing the true top end like production, like play driving defenseman. Morgan Rielly is good in that role, but again, like I don't think he's a true, elite number one guy anymore. And Chris Tanev's, strength is being the defensive guy. So they do lose a bit of that offensive juice from the back end, but overall, like I think it's a pretty strong unit. We jump into Chris Tanev, man, and this is somebody who's been one of, if not the best defensive defenseman in the league for the last 3 years now, right? Like he has been a absolute rock on that blue line. And the best part about it is they're only paying him $4.5 million. Now the deal is extremely long. He still has 5 years left, which is crazy. They're going to be paying him to at least 40, which is nuts to me. But the $4.5 million cap hit, especially, like look what Gavrikov got this year, right? You can go back to watch my Rangers preview, and I think that their style of plays are fairly, like their overall production, and results are very similar. Like build, the results are very similar between him and Tanev, but like the Rangers are paying him like double the money. So Chris Tanev might be the quote unquote best defenseman on this team, but he's not being paid like it, and I think that does add value to what he is. Like in terms of surplus value, this is one of the best deals in the league in that sense. And again, like 34 going on 35, it's hard to ask him to continue being that type of guy. But if he can, still be a top 15 defender, if we're talking about the top defensive defenseman in the league, and Chris Tanev is 15th at that list at the end of the year instead of closer to first, that's still, exceptional value for him. And that's, a pretty big drop off in terms of that. His play reading is still going to be really high. He's never been the fastest guy either. So it's not like he's going to it's not like a loss of like a taking a bit off his speed is going to really affect him because he's never been that guy. So I do think this is somebody that can age really well and has aged exceptionally well as that type of defender. Morgan Rielly is, like I kind of talked about in the overview for this blue line, is I don't think he's a really strong defenseman. He's lost a step, right? Like offensively, he's taken a step back. Defensively, he's taken a step back too, but he was never an elite defender. So with him, like the biggest concern that I have with Rielly is I don't know if he can be, the primary offensive driver for this team anymore. And I think he's more suited to be like, the third guy, quote unquote, which obviously leads to the interesting discussion about like, then who's going to be the primary offensive defenseman for this team? Because I don't think it's Jake McCabe either. Like I don't think Jake McCabe is like a high end enough defenseman to be able to do that, game in and game out. And I think that's really if there was a quote unquote like biggest issue on this blue line, like an area of need that I think they need to address, it's getting a primary like offensive defenseman. I think that is really the key to success here for Toronto, because I think Morgan Rielly is really good, but I think he'd be a lot better served as like a true number 3 on this team. And then you have Jake McCabe, who's your number 4, and then you can have the rest of the blue line kind of falling out the way it is. And I think that would really elevate what this blue line looks like, right? Because I think Morgan Rielly's good, but he'd be a lot better served in a bit of a diminished role at this point, right? Like I think his days of being true number 1 defenseman are kind of over, and for as good as I think Tanev is, he's not going to be that offensive guy, and I don't know if Morgan Rielly is up to the task to be that true offensive guy. I mean, there's a reason why the Leafs were running 5 forwards on their power play, right? Because they didn't have somebody they trusted to be the power play quarterback on the blue line. So it's an interesting situation, because I think Morgan Rielly is still really good, but I don't know if he's good enough at any area to be the primary guy on this blue line anymore, if that makes sense. Like I think he's still really strong, but he's just not strong enough in anything to be a number 1 here. And I do think that could be an issue that comes up at some point here for the Leafs, and could be a reason to be slightly concerned about where this team can end up. So for me, like, people are going to talk about the offense, and obviously, like, I've talked about a lot, losing Marner and replacing those goals up front. But I think the offense, in terms of how it's built, is actually pretty good overall. I think they need, a true number one, like, play driving offensive defenseman here. And if they can get that, then everybody else kind of steps down a role, and I think that'd make this blue line like extremely viable as like arguably the best unit in the league. Like, I think that is like the difference really, and I don't really know where you're gonna find that because there isn't a ton of them available, but I think that would be my primary area of interest if I was running the Leafs and trying to, if I could pick one thing for them to improve on, that would be where I'd pick it. And it's kind of an unconventional pick, just because of like the fact that Morgan Rielly is like good enough to be that guy. But I do think that elevating that role will help elevate the team overall. Jake McCabe, like I talked about, like his offensive production is actually like pretty good, but he's been doing it in a more like sheltered role, right? Like, he's been getting the first line minutes because he's just been playing with Tanev, but I do think that there are a lot of better options than Jake McCabe in terms of like a primary offensive defenseman for your team, right? Like, and again, we're talking about somebody who's 31, right? So it's not like he's young, right? Like, he's not going to start declining, I don't think, but I do think Jake McCabe is a lot more suited to be, a middle of the lineup defenseman. For as much as I really like him as a defenseman, but it does kind of concern me that these are like McCabe and Morgan Rielly are the two like really only true like offensive producers on this blue line, and I do think that's an area that they should look to add to, because the rest of the blue line is good. I mean, obviously you have Chris Tanev, who's maybe the best defenseman in the league. Brandon Carlo is a pretty solid defensive defenseman. Oliver Ekman-Larsson had a nice season last year. Benoit's a fine kind of low event guy for the bottom of the lineup, but I just think they're missing that really true dynamic number one guy. And for as much as I like Jake McCabe as like a very good play driver and a very good transition defenseman, I think his role will be a lot better suited for that middle of the lineup instead of near the top of it. And finally, Brandon Carlo, who I've kind of touched on a little bit here. Brandon Carlo, obviously just a true defensive defenseman, low event. His offensive production is virtually non-existent, but as a penalty killer, he's a very strong penalty killer, very strong, even strength defenseman. He's making $200,000 less than Tanev is. So you combine those two, you're sitting around $8.5 million, and that's pretty solid, right? There's a lot of teams that just paid $8.5 million for one defensive defenseman, right? So you get two of them here, two guys who can just be, shut down, halt play kind of guys. And that's why I'm not like as concerned about the defense as I talked about at the beginning, because they have, these two players here. Now, Carlo's nothing like insanely special defensively, but he's certainly good enough to be, a middle to bottom of the lineup guy in that role. But between him and Tanev, like, I do think that's going to add a lot to what this team can do defensively, even if they're giving up shots and positioning. Like, I think just, both those guys will help remove those second chances. And their goaltending should be stable enough to make sure those primary ones aren't, going in consistently. So even if they're giving up a ton of expected goals, in terms of like location, I do think that this blue line should do a decent enough job, like not allowing those to turn into legitimate chances against and, full on, grade A chances, even if they might, show up that way on the stat card. Finally, Oliver Ekman-Larsson I want to touch on here, because he rejuvenated his career, 2 years ago, but he came into Toronto here as, a depth option, and I think that he was really solid in that role. Right now, he's not going to blow you away with what he can do, but as a bottom of the lineup kind of guy, he was somebody who, when I was watching the Leafs last season, would jump out to me just because it was unexpected for him to jump out to me, right? Like, I hope that makes sense, right? It wasn't somebody that like every game was having a bunch of crazy plays and was like the best defenseman on the team, but he was doing enough good things and, very few bad things. Whereas like, oh wow, like Oliver Ekman-Larsson had a really strong game today, and in reality his numbers weren't phenomenal, but it was just the surprise factor of somebody like him that was looked at one point as a really really good defenseman in Arizona, and then the Vancouver thing debacle happened, and all of a sudden he was like shunned from the NHL, goes to Florida, rejuvenates his career like every castaway defenseman does when they go to Florida. Join the list, and then he had a pretty successful season in Toronto last year as a bottom kind of the lineup kind of guy, and I do think that is where he'll find success, and he should find success again this year. I don't think he's an inoffensive add to the bottom of the lineup, and he does help kind of elevate the floor. He's not going to blow you away. He's not going to move the needle in terms of like getting this team over the hump, but he does help raise the floor and helps kind of make up some of those deficiencies that were there a couple years ago. So he's a fun player to me, and it's good to see him kind of rejuvenize his career both in Florida and now in Toronto, from where it was. And I don't think his numbers have necessarily gotten like significantly better from where they were in his time in Vancouver, but it's just the expectations paired with the salary and the trade and everything that happened that do help kind of mask the fact that he hasn't gotten insanely better. It's just the expectations have kind of gone away. But he's a fun player, and I think that as your third pair defenseman, there's a lot worse options you can have outside of Oliver Ekman-Larsson. Finally, this goalie tandem, which I kind of touched on earlier with Stolarz and Woll, and for me, I mean, Stolarz his numbers are phenomenal, right? Like there's no denying that his numbers are one of the best goalies in the league, right? I think I showed it in the Canadiens video where he was like third in expected goals saved above expected in the last like 2 or 3 years. The problem is he just doesn't play enough, right? Like I can't, like in good conscience, I can't rate him higher than this because he's still playing like 1B goalie numbers, right? Like you look at his games played the last 2 years, and it's 27 in Florida and then 34 last year, right? Now his numbers are phenomenal. I mean, he had a 92.4 save percentage in Florida in 27 games and 92.56 in Toronto. 21.7 goals saved above expected and 31.2. Like that's incredible. It's 52.9 goals saved above expected over the last 2 seasons. Like that's incredible. That's literally like a top 3 or 4 goalie in the NHL, right? But he's not playing enough, right? Like it's really hard for me to like buy into Anthony Stolarz as being like a top 3 goalie in the NHL when he's played like just over 60 games in 2 years. Like it's very hard for me to buy into that, right? It'd be 61 games in 2 seasons, right? Like that's what Connor Hellebuyck plays in 1. Like it's just it's really hard for me to, like, if you're gonna be a true number 1, like you're playing 60 games a season, right? Like that's really the only reason why he's an 84 overall. Like every other number that is here jumps out to me and should say that Anthony Stolarz is like a top 5 goalie in the NHL, but it's just the games played just are not there, and I don't know what it is. Like I really thought that Toronto was going to be the place that like he was, and he had opportunities to kind of take that on. I really hope that this is the year where we see him like jump off the page, because like Joseph Woll's numbers have been good. Like I mean, 25 games, in 23-24, 90.6 save percentage, 8.57 goals saved above expected. In the last year, 42 games played, 90.87, 17.12. Like those are good numbers. But I Stolarz should be the guy on this team, and I really hope he can play like 50 games this season, and we can just see what he is over that kind of sample, because if his numbers contribute, if his numbers can track, and he's putting up 31 goals saved above expected in 34 games, if he continues that pace, like a 50 game season for him, like he'd be in like the 40s or 50s in terms of his goals saved above expected, and that would be exceptional. That'd be like, then we can have a conversation about Anthony Stolarz as a legitimate like top 5 goalie in the league. But I need to see more games played from him. As for Joseph Woll, like his numbers are really solid. I do think that he'd be the 1B in this tandem. And I think that this should be the season where Stolarz just can prove that he is, a top goalie in the league, because his numbers have been fantastic for the last number of years. But he hasn't been given the full opportunity to be a full-time starter. And I really want to see that for him, because his numbers are fantastic. In terms of special teams, like I said, like it's one of the strongest units in the league. I mean, their power play is phenomenal. I mean, Tavares, Matthews, Morgan Riley, and Willie Nylander are all like among the best power play forwards in the NHL, period. And, you get that group of guys together. It looks really good, right? Their second unit isn't the strongest, but that first unit should be so good enough that like the second unit isn't seen a ton anyway. If you're seeing the second unit for Toronto, then things are going bad. In terms of the power play or in terms of the penalty kill, like I think you have a pretty strong unit here. I mean, Chris Tanev's penalty kill numbers aren't great, but he's still, overall a pretty solid player there. I expect Austin Matthews to be better defensively, just being healthy. And Stolarz and Joseph Woll are both pretty solid penalty kill goalies anyway. So overall, like the special teams units are really good. The power play, especially that PP1, is exceptional. And it should carry, brunt of what the special teams unit can do overall. So there you have it. That is my deep dive on the Toronto Maple Leafs. Let me know down below what you think of the Leafs this year. I know it's going to be a pretty divided comment section between Leafs fans and non-Leafs fans, and even between fans of the team in general. I know Leafs fans are fairly split on what they think of this team, but let me know how you think they'll do. I think they'll be in that second round bubble, depending on who they play in the first round. But I don't know if this team is good enough to topple one of the other team that comes out of the Atlantic. But we'll see. I do think that the team is pretty well built overall from top to bottom. There isn't a ton of holes on it. I kind of went over the ones that concern me the most here. But overall, I think they're a pretty solid team. But let me know what you think down below. If you like this video, leave a like. Make sure you subscribe to catch the other 8 videos in this series. We're almost done. Go watch the other ones too. I have videos on every other team that we've done from 32 until now. So go take a look at them. They're in order from my preseason power rankings, if you're curious on the order. But yeah, thank you for watching, and we'll see you for team number 8.